Thank you, Harley. Thank you, Julia and Isabel, for preparing this event today. I'm very happy to be here and to be able to talk about my research. First of all, I want to acknowledge my co-author and collaborator, Professor Ken Shadlin from the LSE. Ken studied here in Berkeley, and he's now chair of the Department of International Development at the LSE. We have been doing this research together for about 2 years. We have funding, small funding from the LSE, a small funding from the São Paulo Research Foundation and the Brazilian Ministry of Science and Technology, mostly to do field research and and it's a mobility grant, so I can travel to the UK and he can come to São Paulo to do research. The research I'm going to present here today, it's ongoing, so I have more questions than answers at the moment. We are trying to understand how the politics of pharmaceuticals happens in Latin America, how countries regulate, and what are the implications of that regulation to society more broadly. The presentation I'm going to give today is divided into 3 steps. So the first one, I'm going to give a context of what is pharmaceutical regulation in Latin America and why this is different from Europe and the US. I'm going to talk a little bit about our research design, or at least what we are planning to investigate with this research. And then I'm going to talk about the case of Brazil, which is something that we know more now because I have been studying pharmaceutical regulation, and Ken as well, pharmaceutical regulation in Brazil for quite a while. So this is the case that at the moment we know the most, but we're expanding this research to other countries, probably Mexico and Argentina as well. I'm going to explain why. So you feel free to interrupt me and ask questions because this is a very technical topic. And sometimes it's important to understand the concepts very well. So first of all, generic drug I think it's something everybody is familiar here in the US. Generics is a copy of a patent drug. So the rationale for generic regulation is that it increases market competition after a patent expires, right? And that will lower the price of the drug because there's competition, and that will increase access to medicines. So that's the idea of creating market competition for generics. So we have several policies to stimulate the demand and supply of generic drugs. Usually international organizations such as the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, the FDA has guidelines on how to stimulate the demand and supply of this drug. So it could be encouraging prescribers to prescribe by the chemical name, encouraging the population to ask the pharmacist for a drug that is cheaper, a generic version of the patent drug when it's available. And so there are several ways to do that. But the thing here is in Latin America, this is not how the market works. And the reason for that is 3 important things that you need to understand. First of all, we see here, so competition is a very important thing in this market. In Latin America, there was always competition because there was no patent protection. So, there's a strong presence of local pharmaceutical companies, so there was competition. But in 1994, with the creation of the World Trade Organization, and the creation of the TRIPS agreement, the patent agreement, that established a new order for the global economy. So since 1994, all countries at some point in time, they would need to comply with patent regulation. So that was a big shock to the pharmaceutical market in Latin America. because there was competition, anybody could copy and create a pharmaceutical company. And from 1994 onwards, that was not the case anymore. So let's say if Julia and I, we wanted to start a pharmaceutical company, we could copy, and it was highly deregulated. Some authors call that the Wild West, because there was no regulation, there was little regulation, and companies could just copy whatever they want. And for this point in time, then that was a big shock in the market. You cannot copy anymore. You can copy old drugs, but not the new ones. Another important shock, so the second step here, we know quite a lot. My co-author, Ken Shadlan, he is an expert in TRIPS implementation in Latin America. He wrote a book that is called Coalition and Compliance. It's by Oxford University Press. And he studied how countries in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina implemented the TRIPS agreements in different points of time. So one thing that we don't know much is this third step here. So in 1999, the Pan American Health Organization decided to harmonize the rules for pharmaceutical regulation in Latin America. And the reason for that, well, we read the documents, but we're still trying to understand why this happened at this point of time. Because, first of all, because the market was highly deregulated, so countries needed to increase capacity and the quality of patent drugs. So this is one thing that they say the reason for creating this harmonization network. The second reason, which I find very curious, is because of trade. So why an international organization concerned with health was worried about facilitating trade in the Americas at that point of time. So, so when you harmonize the standards, that would make easier for companies to sell drugs in different countries. Because when you have one rule in Brazil for packaging and for labeling, and then in Argentina is different, so the company needs to create a new package and new strategies to sell drugs in other countries. So one of the reasons that those documents say is because they wanted to facilitate trade. Another thing that we see in this document from 1999, there was a strong encouragement, I would say, from the FDA to local countries, for countries in Latin America to comply with FDA regulations. Because of the respect we have for the FDA and the quality of the regulations, I would say. We're still trying to understand what regulation is that and what are the rules and if that should apply to Latin America. But it has been very, like I said in the description of the event today, I wanted to discuss the challenges of doing field work in that topic. And one of the challenges has been to contact informants that participated in this network back in the 90s. We have access to them, but they don't want to talk. And documents that are available are not that informative. So I will probably need to go to Geneva and to Washington to get access to the archives of the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization to assess and explore documents that are not available online, and to see if that can illuminate more why that happened in that point of time. So three important topics in this agenda of the Pan American Health Organization was good manufacturing practice, meaning that companies should comply with some standard of production to protect the labor, to protect workers, and to protect the population. So we need to have to take careful steps when producing drugs. The second one is bioequivalence. I'm going to talk about that later. And the third one is good clinical practice. Good clinical practice means clinical trials. So in terms of getting protection to patients in clinical trials and to comply with ethical criteria. So that was another important topic. But bioequivalence is something key to this presentation here today. Bioequivalence is the test that says a generic drug is equal to a patent drug. So that concept was created here in the United States by FDA experts. And the reason why they created this in the 1980s was to facilitate the market entry of generics, because previous to that, companies had to go to the same clinical trials as a patent drug. So bioequivalence was a shortcut. So and there's a very, very interesting study from the Harvard professor, I'm going to show you very quickly. It's called Bioequivalence, the Regulatory Career of a Pharmaceutical Concept. I think this research is amazing in terms of the quality of the data that he collected and how he analyzed the politics of creating a regulatory concept that has a lot of influence in the market. So, so one of the things that I think is very interesting, and I don't understand yet how this concept traveled from the US to the World Health Organization. But why should we care about bioequivalence? First, it's very expensive for local pharmaceutical companies to perform this test. You are adding a layer of regulation. And so they already had a big shock with the patent regulation, and now they will have a second shock with increasing barriers to market entry with bioequivalence. Also, there's a lot of discussion of what drugs should require bioequivalence. Do you think like all drugs should be exactly equal to a patent drug? Would you take a generic drug that is not that did not perform bioequivalence? Do you think drugs should be exactly equal to? Yes. Yeah. So that's a big discussion, and not everybody agrees with that.
Sure.
And the first time I read about this was a Colombian scholar. The article was writing in Spanish, and I found that very interesting, the argument that he was making. Colombia has a very progressive regulation for generic drugs. We don't know yet why is that, but most of the articles that question that, they are written in Spanish and by Colombian authors. And another thing that is very problematic with bioequivalence in Latin America is the fact that countries need to create capacity to perform these tests because they don't know how to do it. At least back in the day, they didn't know how to do it. And so I'm not arguing against this concept. I'm just saying how the situation is now today. Yeah.
That's a question. So what's the current regulation of drugs? Like in Brazil, can you just manufacture something in your kitchen with ibuprofen, label it 200 milligrams per tablet, and they put on the market?
That's what I'm gonna. That's what we are looking at. We are trying to understand. In Brazil, not anymore. It's different for each country. Some countries have independent regulatory agencies, such as the FDA. Brazil has an independent regulatory agency. Argentina, no. So some departments, regulatory departments, are attached to the Ministry of Health. And some of them can be very sensible to political swifts. And when the president or the head of the state change, then the whole Ministry of Health changes as well, so as the regulatory department. So this is something we are trying to understand as well, whether we need an independent regulatory agency or not, and why. So, but I'm going to explain a bit more of this. I'm going to compare the countries and at least the data we have so far. So here we have two processes happening at the same time. So we have a transition for a competition based on deregulation to competition based on regulation. So countries are concerned about removing barriers to market entry, such as patents, but at the same time creating new barriers because they are concerned with quality issues. In Latin America, these things are happening at the same time, which is different here from the US and Europe. And the support for generic drugs usually come from health officials and international organizations that are concerned with the quality and price of drugs. So key stakeholders here, international organizations, and the diffusion of these norms to these countries. So here is another interesting thing. You can see this is a Business Monitor International forecast for generic drug sales in different regions of the world. So you can see Asia Pacific has a strong market for generic drugs, Europe as well, and North America. But Latin America, the pink line, and Africa and Middle East, they're very small. Why do you think is that? Do you think these countries are not consuming generic drugs? Are they buying only patent drugs? You see, it's something that is very interesting. The reason for that is not...
North America is just the US or Canada and Mexico?
North America is Mexico as well.
And Canada.
Yeah, in Canada, yeah. But when you look at how they measure that market, they only look at bioequivalent drugs. And in Latin America, the majority of drugs are not bioequivalent, except from Brazil and Mexico, as I'm going to show later on. So you see here, it's very difficult to compare markets in these countries because they define drugs in a very different ways. So we adapted this from a Pan-American Health Organization report, and we are trying to understand how countries define their pharmaceutical products. So Brazil, we have 3 different types of pharmaceutical products. We have innovator original drugs, similar drugs, and generic drugs. Some countries, like Peru and Bolivia, they have branded drugs. And generics, usually when you just sell drugs by their chemical name, and it doesn't need to go through any tests. So it's very difficult to compare the market for generics in this region because they name the product in different ways, and generic means different things.
Can you go back on the graph, please?
Yeah.
So you are looking at the evolution of the share.
Yeah.
The share.
Yeah.
So North America almost doesn't appear.
You mean Latin America?
No, Latin America.
Oh, so
The
pink-
the red is
North America.
Ah, okay. No. Okay.
It's North
Latin
America.
I thought it was
It's the pink
Latin.
one.
Okay.
Yeah, it's North America. So here is our study. So what we're investigating. So there's increasing attention to from global actors. So the Pan-American Health Organization, the World Health Organization, and there are several networks to encourage pharmaceutical regulation and harmonize converge. The regulation should converge throughout countries. That's their argument. But most of the literature on pharmaceutical regulation is related to the global north. So we have, like I said, Dan Carpenter from Harvard that does brilliant work in pharmaceutical regulation here in the US, John Abraham in the UK and Europe, but we know very little about how this happened in developing countries, particularly generic regulation per se. So what we are trying to address here is the analytical gaps. First of all, the political economic dynamics of generic regulation in the global south and in Latin America. And we developed a typology to compare countries in 3 dimensions, and then we want to explain the variation. I'm going to talk about this typology later. But in terms of contribution to the literature, we are grounding our research on the political economy of market regulation, so creating new competition, but different from the competition that existed before. A key author to this literature is a professor from Berkeley, called David Vogel from the political science department. His literature is very interesting in how to educate capitalists.
How to educate who?
Capitalists.
Okay.
So, and creating new competition. It's not, he says that the global economy is not about removing regulatory barriers, but creating competition through new regulatory regulations. And that's what happened to the World Trade Organization, right? Like basically, we have free market, but it's highly regulated through the World Trade Organization, for example. And that happens with environmental and other issues that he studies as well. So, so our typology has 3 dimensions. I'm going to talk first about equivalence tests, and this is going to be the focus of this presentation here today. So key actors against bioequivalence are local firms because of the costs associated to these tests. Some regulators as well. Like I said, Colombia has a very progressive understanding for that, and Argentina as well. So they oppose to any source of broad harmonization of bioequivalence rules in Latin America. You can see that by reading the memos of the meetings at the Pan American Health Organization. It's very clear who are the actors supporting and against, but we still need to do research and interviews to understand better what are their preferences and what they're thinking. Another important element of this typology is how to get drugs to consumers and the use of a chemical name to sell drugs in Latin America. So rules on prescriptions, doctors should prescribe by using a chemical name. Patients should be able to exchange their drugs, but here you have another political economy issue because doctors, they don't want the government to interfere with their prescription rules. They want to be able to choose whether they want to prescribe a patent or a generic name, and they are a very strong professional community, and they are usually against government interfering in that area. So there's also a huge step in promoting education and building trust on generics, because not everybody thinks that generic is a good product. Sometimes the population think it's a low quality because it's not patented. And then the commodification of firms, that is very here looking at. And the third thing is packaging and labeling. Believe it or not, but that affects retailing, because you go to retail in Brazil, generic drugs, they have a G. So you can see that that is a commodity. You can change that for other products. But when you have a brand name, how do you know you can switch, I don't know, one drug that is branded for a generic? So plain packaging is something that facilitates retailing of pharmaceuticals. Is that clear here? Does anyone have a question? So what we are trying to do at the moment is map 9 countries. We are looking at Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. So here is, I'm going to talk more about this. So here is what happened, the question that you asked, how is it to other countries in Latin America adapt that? So you see that Brazil and Mexico, they are extremely precautious. They require bioequivalence for all drugs that, to enter in the generic markets or similar market in Brazil. All drugs must provide bioequivalence. Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, they have lists of drugs. Argentina, less than 10 drugs are required to provide bioequivalence. And you asked me, so what is the criteria to include a drug in that list? We don't know. In Chile, for example, you asked the pharmaceutical company, so how did Chile came out with that list? And they say, we don't know, we don't understand, because there are some drugs there that are old. We usually wouldn't require bioequivalence for those drugs, but Chile requires that. So we don't understand how they came out with that list. And usually the argument is that for drugs that are toxic, so if you have like a small amount extra or lower, that can have strong side effects in the body. So let's require bioequivalence for those drugs, because you cannot, if you change a little bit of the dosage, can make a difference. So usually this is the argument that countries use, and that's a concept that was created within the Pan American Health Organization meetings. Not any other country in the world uses, a region in the world uses that, just in Latin America. So Argentina, Chile, Colombia, we classify that as moderate regulation. Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, it's very lax. They don't require bioequivalence at all. So you can register a drug there, a generic drug, and you don't need to perform any tests. So it's highly deregulated.
Where would the U.S. fall into this?
The U.S. is Mexico and Brazil. Brazil and Mexico emulated the FDA. The FDA is very strict in regulating. So the problem with that is that you exclude competition, because if companies are not able to adapt, so they cannot sell drugs in that market. And so if you reduce competition, prices, so you have a small amount of firms commercializing drugs in that market, prices could go up. We don't know that yet, but that's what could happen if you don't have enough competition in this commodity market. I'm not going to talk about this much now, but just so that you can have an idea what we are trying to do here. We are classifying if physicians can prescribe or not, if pharmacists are allowed to prescribe or not. We are still validating this table here. The same with packaging and labeling. We are trying to understand what countries require. You can see, for example, that Ecuador has a particular color of red that a generic box must have to be commercialized in Ecuador. In Brazil, you need a G and a yellow stripe. So the size of the name of the brand name and the name of the chemical name has to be in a certain amount font size. So there are lots of regulations. So for pharmaceutical companies, this is a nightmare because if they want to sell a drug in Ecuador, they need to create a new box for Ecuador, a new box for Colombia, and sometimes you have like just a small amount of medicines commercialized in Ecuador, and they need to create a specific box just for that market. So here now I'm gonna talk about the case of Brazil. So how Brazil came out with that regulatory pattern. the first politician actor to try to implement generic drugs in Brazil was Eduardo Jorge in 1991. He was a congressman affiliated with the health movement, and then the Minister of Health in 1993, Jamil Haddad. So the problem with this, the design of this regulation is they said that you exclude a brand name and you have a generic. There was no test. They said like the market now, the pharmaceutical market in Brazil will not be able to commercialize drugs by brand names. It's not just local from everyone, like multinationals and local pharmaceutical companies. From now on, everybody will use the chemical name. So that was a huge impact on the market because the pharmaceutical sector, they formed a large coalition against both politicians. And they said no. They went to courts. They said they wouldn't adapt to that regulation because a brand name is very important for them. And generics is not just excluding a brand name. So there was a strong reaction from the regulated sector. Strong opposition for local pharmaceutical companies, multinational pharmaceutical companies, and prescribers as well, because the law also said prescribers should prescribe by a chemical name. So there was a strong opposition against this, and so that was a dead law. He presented a bill. The Congress took forever to assess the bill, and then the Minister of Health tried to impose that by decree, and the decree, so pharmaceutical companies didn't adapt, drugstores didn't sell drugs using chemical names, and prescribers were not prescribing by generic names. So that didn't happen. But in 1998, as you can expect, because the market was so deregulated, we started listening from crisis and public health crisis because of the use of drugs. So here we had problems with blood banks because there was no regulation on blood banks, and people were getting HIV and AIDS through transfusion. And also the pharmaceutical sector was also having problems. So here what happened in Brazil was women were getting pregnant because they took birth control pills that were inactive. So lots of women got pregnant in that period, and the Minister of Health was visiting them and trying to, this is Serra, the one that was pushing the new regulation. So that was a huge scandal, a huge public health scandal. There was also records of fake cancer drugs that were circulating in the market. So he said, and this happened in a particular point of time. He was running for election, and he decided to do something about that political health crisis. So what he did, he got the bill presented by Eduardo Jorge and upgraded. So he said, generics now will use a chemical name, but will have a bioequivalence. All generic drugs in Brazil from now on will have a bioequivalence. And he lobbied strongly Congress to approve that law. The political process, I can talk about this later if you want to know. I won't get into the details, but he was very savvy in breaking the lobby of local pharmaceutical companies. He didn't negotiate with the representative of pharmaceutical companies. He refused to talk to the association, and he was only talking to pharmaceutical companies individually, and that breaks collective action. So I can talk about this later, but what happened after this law was that local pharmaceutical companies that was once opposed to the bioequivalence regulation, they adapt. And now they are the market leaders in Brazil. you can see here in 2007, 88% of almost 90% of the market was dominated by local pharmaceutical companies. And here you have the ranking of local pharmaceutical companies, the rank of the pharmaceutical sector in Brazil. So in 1999, the first one was Sanofi, and here in 2009, almost 10 years after, EMS is a Brazilian company, is the leader in the market. Not just generic, in the whole sector. And the same for Aché, Medley, and Europharma. So these companies, they adapted to the norm, and now they became market leaders in Brazil and Latin America. So this is a very interesting story, how regulation creates new competition and how firms adapt to that. In the case of Mexico, is different from Brazil because local firms weren't able to adapt and they disappeared because they could not comply with the stringent regulation that the Mexican government created. I don't have that slide here because we are still doing research there. But so it's very different from Brazil. I can also talk why Brazil was why local pharmaceutical companies in Brazil were able to succeed. Yeah, but that's the story we are trying to understand, like building new institutions and regulation to create competition, and then compare the case of Argentina and Mexico. I'm sorry, I took more time than I should, but thank you. Thank you.
Any questions or comments? I actually did a pre-study of what you're working on. Very recently in Chile, against our will, Professor Mons was looking for some medication that had been prescribed in the U.S. to pick up in Chile. A very common medication. No pharmacy had it. And looking back, it's precisely because of what you were saying, they were not selling these brand names. So probably the pharmacist didn't know the brand name, but if you provide the chemical name, he would be able to find
and
it.
it's very, I can't remember what it was, but very, very common here. And it was like, oh, I don't know, let's look it up. And one of them finally found, oh, it has this, so that would be this one that we have here. Yeah.
The names, they changed it as well. They cannot use the same name in Portuguese and Spanish and English because I think doesn't work in some markets. So that's why packaging is so important, because they have different names and the way they commercialize this is different in every country.
Are you aware of a program in Guatemala and I think also in Mexico of popular pharmacies?
Yeah.
I can't remember the name they have.
Yeah, we do. We do know about that. Like, I'm not the person responsible for the Mexican country. My colleague is.
The name is Farmacias Similares.
Eso, farmacias.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
So you don't use the name generics. You use similar. It's similars. Is
We
that?
have generics and similars.
It's and similars, right? Okay. But your similars are bioequivalent, or you don't know?
No, it's generic are
Bioequivalent. And similar, no. I think they are now.
So they are cheaper.
They are cheaper, yeah.
And
But
then in Mexico too now, right? Those pharmacies.
They started in Mexico.
Or they started in Mexico and then they moved
And
to
then
Guatemala.
Guatemala.
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So.
Any thoughts about China and India?
Oh, China and India are different. Well, India took advantage of the patent protection. They adapted in 2005, so they were able to copy whatever they wanted until 2005. And China, I don't know how the patent, probably the same as India, they took full advantage of that. But the market, I think the way it works in China and India are different, because some of the drugs are provided by the government here. There's a strong out-of-pocket payment, but I know in India, there are limitations, right, on what the government is providing, and the out-of-pocket percentage is high as well. But we are not looking into those markets because, well, what started this process in Latin America was the Pan American Health Organization. So that's something that was related in this region. And I think India and China, they are related to other international networks, I guess. And yeah. But they probably face a similar problem as well in terms of regulating the off-patent market.
Are you familiar with what's happening in India and China?
I know there's drugstores all over the place.
Yeah, you see? Yeah, because
Thousands of things.
yeah, in developing countries, it's very common to pay for drugs out of pocket. And I think here you have insurance, and your insurance pay part of of that, right?
Yeah.
Or at least you reimburse.
With changes in governments very recently in Mexico and in Brazil, do you envision any changes in this?
And I don't think so, especially Brazil and Mexico, because their regulatory agencies are very insulated from politics. I cannot speak much about the Mexican case, but in Brazil, definitely, the head of the regulatory agency is appointed, but there's a strong civil servant staff that are very technical, and they don't allow much of the way they build the regulation. The way the system works in terms of how they assess, well, it could be political interference. For example, my company wants to register a drug in Brazil. So I'm going to the head of the National Surveillance Agency and bribe him to allow market entry of my drug without providing such huge requirements for market entry. But that doesn't happen because the way the system is built, and you cannot change the line. There's a line, and that is electronic, and the civil servant community is very technical. And to be honest, I never heard I heard complaints. Oh, they appointed this guy from the market to the head of the regulatory agency, but in terms of changing market entry, I think it would be very difficult. It would be very difficult to interfere in that nowadays. Yeah, but I know it happens. I heard a lot of complaints about the Peru case. I was interviewing some pharmaceutical companies that market their drugs in Peru, and they were telling me how difficult it is, because when the government changes the whole regulatory agency, and then they can change the rules that the previous government adapted and prescribed it, and then it can be very difficult to sell drugs in such a stable regulatory environment. So that's the complaint that they make. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I have a question. So in terms of regulation stimulating competition, the ideal is to use the chemical names.
Well, I wouldn't say the ideal, because I don't know if there's some ideal regulation in that market. But yeah, to stimulate competition when you don't have a brand name is easier, because that's a commodity. You change this bottle of water that there's no brand to another bottle of water. But if you want a Fiji, then yeah.
But well, in the case of the U.S., which is one of the most strict regulations,
Yeah.
that they still use brand names. So
They use brand names,
so
yeah.
that exists a country where they only use the chemical names.
I don't think so. I think pharmaceutical companies, they prefer, when they can, they prefer, I would say they prefer to sell their drugs using a brand name. What they do, like I said here, instead of using a brand name, they use the name of the firm becomes the brand. So you have like a generic from Bayer. So you see the news, in the news they say like, buy the generic from Bayer because that's the best generic. Or they change the box, like my box is blue. In Brazil I have Europharma, was a blue box with a G stripe. So the consumer put trust in the name of the firm and not the brand.
Yeah.
So the market adapts to that, but they need to differentiate themselves. The key thing here is if your doctor is prescribing you paracetamol, is that Tylenol, right? So there's no way a company would go to the doctor and lobby the doctor to prescribe paracetamol from Europharma or paracetamol from Bayer. I don't know. So what they do, their commercial strategies are target to consumers and not doctors anymore. So they stimulate the consumer to request the paracetamol from Bayer. So that's the way their commercial strategy is different when they can't sell when they sell a brand and when they sell a commodity. Yeah.
I have another question. So, do you know if Bolsonaro's administration have introduced any changes in the regulatory agency?
Not so far. He just started. Not so far. I think he's worried about other things. If that is not very. That is not very popular with politicians. Like pharmaceutical regulation is not very popular with politicians. Here in the U.S., yes, but usually it's not something that you see in the platform of different politicians. Apart from Serra, that he claims to be the father and of the policy, but it's not something that you usually see in, at least in Brazil. Probably it's so complicated that their electors don't understand that very well, this sort of thing here. Very difficult to explain to academics. Can you imagine that, to educate the population on what is a bioequivalent drugs is also very difficult.
What type of health insurance system is in Brazil?
In Brazil, we have public service and also private insurance, mostly provided by companies. When you work to a company, for example, I work for FGV, I have a private health insurance.
So everyone in Brazil has insurance?
No,
Health insurance?
25% of
What percent?
25%.
Half,
Yeah,
and the rest?
and the rest goes to the public health service. And decreasing now because of the unemployment, so they don't have access anymore through private providers, so they need to go to the public health.
So if I'm unemployed in Brazil and a very poor person and I'm ill,
You go to the public
which
service.
means what? You go to a public
You
hospital?
go to a public hospital.
Doctor?
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
And I get my drugs through that public?
You can get your drugs through the government if your state or your municipality have that drug, if it's an expensive drug that is provided by the federal government. So Brazil has this huge program of providing high-cost drugs to the population. So cancer drugs, HIV and AIDS, hepatitis, diabetes, all this heart disease, everything. Those sort of drugs are provided by the government.
And I could also go to a hospital and get a major operation,
Yes.
surgery.
Yes, you can. You
It's
can.
going to take a while.
Yeah. There are long waiting lists.
What if I can't wait?
Then you die. Yeah.
Depends on the case.
Yeah, totally. Depends on the case.
Depends
Yeah.
on the hospital.
Yeah, you're right. Depends.
Yes, what kind of
Yeah.
hospital?
There are like huge hospitals that you can skip the line. So you are 5 months from your surgery and it's urgent.
Yeah.
You can wait 1 month.
Yeah.
But there are others that
Yeah.
you're going to die.
I think that's the major public health issue in Brazil. How do you provide adequate care for tertiary care, like the high cost care?
Is that a political issue? Like in
Yes.
this country?
Well, I think there are different reasons for that. One, we are a federal country, and the municipality, they didn't include high-cost care. So usually that is provided by the state, and the capacity of each state and each municipality is different in Brazil. You can ask me how and why, I don't know. I can tell you that healthcare is more coordinated than education policies. Because the way the federalism works, federal commitments work in health is different from education. Education is devolved to, and health is centralized at it used to be, not anymore, but from 2 or 3 years now it changed. But it used to be centralized, the policy was centralized at the Ministry of Health, and that facilitated coordination. But we have different, well, one of the things you know about Brazil is inequality, and not just inequality of access to health, but also the capacity of states and municipalities to deliver adequate care is very different. São Paulo, you probably, you'll be fine, but maybe in a small town in the northeast of Brazil, you wouldn't have access perhaps to some hospital that you need. So yeah, but that depends on the case as well, and it's very difficult to generalize. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Well, it is not a question.
Or a comment.
Yes, well, I would like to share an announcement, if I may.
Yes.
Next month, we are starting an online course between UC Berkeley, the School of Public Health, and several Mexican institutions. This is an online course about the science of regulations related to drug development and medical devices. So it is the first kind of this course. It has 12 modules. 8 of them are about all the international perspective about regulations, and 4 of them are related to Mexico and their particular conditions. We expect to expand this kind of program to Latin America. So, well,
How do we get information about
I
that?
have the information.
We would be very interested in this.
Good. So you're in the School of Public Health?
Exactly.
Oh, nice.
The UC Mexico initiative.
Oh, wow.
Wow,
Health work.
that's interesting. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah.
One last quick question.
Yeah.
What's the?
It will be, well, one idea is that because it is for Mexico, it will be in Spanish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
With subtitles for the people.
Oh, subtitles.
Veronica,
Okay.
Is Veronica Miller is a professor in the School of Public Health, and she is on the UC side, she is the leader of the program.
I just want to know, do you know what the, in the rural areas of Brazil, or anywhere else, or well, in Brazil, what's the ratio of doctor per inhabitant?
Oh, that's a good question, but I don't know now by head. I don't know. But
Does anyone know, like for Mexico or for Guatemala or Chile?
We know there's a huge problem of getting doctors to that region because that's why we have Mais Médicos. You probably heard of that. It's a government initiative to bring Cuban doctors to Brazil to fill those
Are they
areas.
still there now with the new
Not
government?
anymore. Not anymore. They left. And the government started a new program. It just started a month ago. I don't know if they will be able to keep all those doctors within those regions because, well, the salary is not very good. It's difficult to.
The hardship to be there.
Yeah. So that used to be a problem, yeah, and now it can be a problem again.
Well, with that, I want to thank Elize
Thank you.
for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all.
And everyone for coming.